Brooke Sullivan had been walking toward the ICU entrance of St. Michael's for 8 months when she realized she'd learned to move like someone being watched. Shoulders squared. Eyes forward. The kind of stillness that comes from surviving things worse than hospital politics, things like the Jolin district in 2009, things like holding 3 liters of blood in a field tent while rounds pinged off metal frames, things like coming home and finding out the army had given her a different job entirely. She pushed through the double doors at 6:44 p.m., 12 minutes before her shift started, the same way she did every night. Early arrival had become habit. Hospitals were like combat zones: never enter tired, never rush, never let anyone catch you unprepared. The smell hit her first, antiseptic layered over something deeper, the copper-sweet scent of old blood that ventilation systems never quite managed to erase. She'd learned to read hospital smells the way soldiers read wind direction. Good wounds. Bad wounds. Terminal wounds. This place had all 3, and tonight would be no exception. Her badge, attached to a faded lanyard with a medical insignia worn nearly blank, swung against her ribs as she walked. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Army Nurse Corps, twice decorated, holder of a silver star she'd never acknowledged and a bronze star she kept wrapped in plastic at the bottom of a footlocker. The Pentagon had been clear: your uniform stays invisible. Your rank stays silent. You blend. The night shift ICU at St. Michael's was a landscape of ventilators and 4 pumps, of monitor cables draped like neural pathways between machines and dying people. Brooke moved through it with the economical precision of someone whose hands had learned their work under circumstances that left no room for wasted motion. 8 months of night shifts had cemented her into the rhythm of the place, the precise moment when the day nurse's chaos yielded to the night nurse's focused quiet, when the fluorescent light seemed to hum at exactly the same frequency as the ventilators, when you could actually hear someone thinking if they thought loud enough. Dr. Pierce entered the unit at 6:52 p.m., 7 minutes before handoff officially began, which meant he was there for reasons unrelated to medical necessity. Brooke recognized the pattern by now. He'd begun appearing at odd hours, not during crises, not during scheduled rounds, but in those liminal moments when the unit was shifting personnel and attention was fragmented. He wore the kind of confidence that came from never having faced a consequence he couldn't lawyer away, a tailored coat over scrubs that cost more than Brooke's monthly rent, a watch that probably cost more than her car. His face was handsome in the way that aggressive men often were: sharp lines, clear skin, the kind of looks that made people trust him before they knew better. He'd been using that for leverage since she arrived. "Gentlemen," he said to the incoming residents clustered near the chart station, his voice pitched just loud enough for Brooke to hear from across the unit where she was reviewing medication administration records. "I wanted to give you a heads up about staffing dynamics. We've had some inconsistencies in performance lately. It's important you understand the actual competency levels on this unit before you make decisions about care protocols." He paused, the kind of calculated silence that made people lean in. Some nurses come to us with stellar references that don't necessarily reflect their actual work history. Firing circumstances that get glossed over. Missing years that nobody wants to discuss. Brooke's hands continued moving through the MAR, her fingers tracking down columns of medication entries with the same precision she'd used to track weapons counts in a field hospital. She didn't look up. She'd learned 8 months ago that looking up was the same as flinching, and Dr. Pierce had made a study of teaching people to flinch. The young residents, all of them 6 to 10 years younger than her, all of them male, all of them still believing that hierarchies were meritocracies, glanced toward her briefly, then back at Pierce with the expression of people who'd just been handed a useful social map. "I'm just saying," Pierce continued, moving toward the coffee station, "do your own verification. Don't assume credentials are complete just because someone presents them with confidence. Some people get very good at performing competence." He smiled then, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. Especially the quiet ones. The way the room shifted was almost imperceptible. A resident stopped leaning against the counter. Another one straightened his papers. The senior resident, a man named Kessler with the kind of aggressive intelligence that made him Pierce's perfect protégé, began nodding slowly like he was filing information. Brooke had watched Pierce do this 12 times in the past month. Different variations. Same architecture, plant doubt, create distance, make the target seem unreliable without stating anything specific enough to be actionable. It was a precise form of institutional poisoning, designed to work slowly, designed to make everyone around you question your judgment before they even saw your work. She finished the MAR at 6:58 p.m., every entry correct, every signature clear, every notation in the proper format. Then she moved to Bay 4, where Major Garrett had been sleeping in a medically induced quiet for 3 weeks. The moment she saw him, something inside her shifted. His chart said he was a 54-year-old male, former military, admitted with acute myocardial infarction, stable on current regimen, prognosis guarded. But his chart didn't show what Brooke could see, the way his uniform photograph, placed on the bedside table by his wife in a moment of need, showed a man in a 5th Special Forces Group combat shirt, the patch visible on his shoulder. The same patch. The exact same patch, green and gold and faded with wear, that her son Michael had worn on his uniform before it came home without him. Before the folded flag. Before the bugle call that sounded like someone's heart breaking in brass. She moved to adjust his ventilator settings, her hands moving with a steadiness that came from knowing they had to. The machines beat their usual rhythm, cardiac monitor at a steady 68 beats, oxygen saturation at 97%, blood pressure a comfortable 118/74. Stable. Sleeping. Alive. Her fingers traced the ventilator's dial, checking flow rates, checking sedation infusion, checking everything twice because checking twice meant you didn't miss things and missing things meant people died. Her other hand, the left one, marked with a thin scar that ran from her wrist to her third knuckle, souvenir of a wound management procedure in 2008, smoothed the blanket across his chest with the kind of care that came from knowing exactly how fragile human beings were. The Pentagon had been clear when they'd recruited her for this assignment, 8 months ago in a hotel room in Arlington. Major James Garrett, the colonel had said, showing her a file that she was supposed to forget she'd ever seen. Investigating procurement fraud in the Afghan supply chain. He was about to blow the whistle when he had this cardiac event. Convenient timing. We need someone inside St. Michael's ICU, someone who can monitor his care, someone he won't suspect because she's just the night nurse. You're available. You need a cover identity. This is a good fit. She'd asked the obvious question, what if he dies while I'm watching? The colonel hadn't blinked. Then he dies. But he probably won't, because you're going to be very good at your job, the same way you were very good at every other job you've ever had. 12 years of that. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. He'd paused. The Army doesn't forget its people, Captain Sullivan. And neither does the Pentagon. The MacGuffin, that's what she thought of it, in the language of her civilian cover, was the patch. The faded 5th Group patch she'd sewn into the lining of her work jacket, the one that matched the one Major Garrett wore in his photograph, the one that her son had died wearing in Fallujah when an IED turned a routine patrol into a funeral. She touched it through the fabric of her scrub jacket now, a small gesture of contact, a prayer in the language of military protocol. Then she checked his monitors one more time and moved on, because lingering was the same as caring, and caring was the same as compromising the mission. Dr. Pierce was waiting near the chart station when she turned around. He stood with the casual dominance of someone who'd learned early that most people would move out of his way, and they did. He held her personnel file open in his hands, the same file that had to be carefully constructed, the same file that would withstand surface checking but would never withstand deep Pentagon-level investigation. He smiled as she approached. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice soft enough that the residents couldn't quite hear it but loud enough to make sure they noticed his tone. "I'm looking at your work history. 3 different hospitals in 5 years. You're remarkably mobile for someone in nursing." He closed the file slowly, deliberately. "Different reasons for leaving each one, I see." She stopped 3 feet from him, a distance that was professional but not deferential. "Is there a clinical concern, Doctor?" "Just making sure we understand who we're working with." He opened the file again, his eyes tracking lines she couldn't see. References from Seattle. References from San Diego. Curious that they're all generic. All careful. He looked up. "You're a careful person, aren't you, Captain?" He paused, his eyes knowing something they shouldn't know. "Ms. Sullivan." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. "My work stands for itself," Brooke said, her voice measured, her hand steady at her sides. "Medication administration records are clean. Patient outcomes are above unit average. Incident reports number 0. For now," Pierce said, closing the file with a soft click that sounded like a trap springing. "But we're still learning about you." She turned away from him, back toward the unit, back toward her patients, back toward the mission that had nothing to do with herself and everything to do with keeping Major Garrett breathing until whoever had tried to kill him in a hospital somewhere in Colorado finally made a mistake. Pierce watched her go, and she felt the weight of his attention like a scope's laser, and she knew with absolute certainty that he sensed something in her he couldn't quite categorize. He was intelligent enough to be dangerous. Insufficient intelligence to understand that he was standing 3 feet from someone who'd survived things that would have broken him into pieces. The night shift stretched ahead, long and quiet and full of the particular danger that comes from people who begin to understand that their world isn't quite what they thought. The fluorescent lights hummed their surgical monotone as Dr. Pierce entered Major Garrett's ICU room at 11:33 a.m., his white coat moving like a blade through the filtered air. Brooke stood at the bedside, her hand steady as she adjusted the vasopressor infusion, dopamine climbing in micrograms per kilogram per minute, Garrett's systolic pressure responding incrementally. His wife sat rigid in the visitor's chair, their teenage son standing behind her with the particular hollowness of a kid watching his father tethered to machines. "Nurse Sullivan." Pierce's voice had the texture of gravel under a heel. "Did you change these settings?" "Yes, doctor." His pressure was dropping at 0400, and protocol. He cut her off as if she hadn't spoken. "Protocol? You've been here 8 months and you think you understand protocol better than a physician." His eye swept toward the family with theatrical concern. "I apologize. We're still training some of our less experienced staff." He turned back to Brooke, his smile carrying the particular cruelty of a man who'd spent 8 months building an audience for this moment. "These are my orders, Nurse Sullivan. My orders. Not yours. When you decide you understand the difference, perhaps you'll be ready for something beyond bedside monitoring." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, the steady wheeze of compressed air, the soft hiss of oxygen, the faint beep of the cardiac monitor marking time like a metronome counting down something that hadn't started yet. Garrett's wife's hand went to her mouth. Their son's jaw tightened. Pierce waited, expecting Brooke to apologize, to stumble backward, to validate his authority through her deference. Instead, she met his eyes. Not with anger. Not with submission. With the kind of absolute stillness that belonged to someone who'd held a field hospital together under siege. "Your insecurity is showing, doctor." Her voice had dropped half an octave. "You might want to get that checked." She turned and walked out of the room with surgical precision, each step measured, her shoulders level, her pace unhurried despite the fact that Pierce's face had gone the color of skim milk. She didn't rush. She didn't tremble. She didn't look back. The sound of her shoes striking the tile was the only noise, each footstep a separate sentence, none of them an apology. Pierce stood motionless in that ICU room for 7 seconds. Then he followed her into the hallway, his voice cracking like her adolescence. "That kind of insubordination will be documented, Sullivan. You understand that? Documented." She was already 3 rooms away, her badge swinging against her sternum, already past caring about documentation. The break room at 12:23 p.m. smelled like old coffee and regret. Brooke pushed through the door and found 6 nurses seated at the laminate tables, 2 residents at the counter with lunch containers spread before them. She poured coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 7 a.m., black, acidic, perfect. The moment her bottom touched the plastic chair, one of the nurses stood. Then another. Then all of them, moving in sequence like dominoes responding to physics, none of them making eye contact. 90 seconds. That was how long it took for the room to empty. The older nurses left first, the ones who'd worked with Pierce for 3 years and understood which way the wind blew. Then the residents, one of them the younger Dr. Brooke, had tutored through her ACLS recertification, helping her pass the written exam by reviewing rhythm strips at 6 a.m. before shift. That resident wouldn't meet her eyes either. She just gathered her container and left, following the current of institutional self-preservation. Brooke sat alone with her coffee. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their insect-like hum. Somewhere in the hallway, she heard whispers, the sound of people who thought distance and doorways could keep words contained. Fired from 3 hospitals. I heard she falsified her certifications. Asked to leave her last unit. Each lie was a small stone. By evening, they would have built a wall. She took another sip of coffee. It had already gone lukewarm. She didn't taste it. The unit board occupied space on the wall outside the medication room, where every nurse had to look at it at least 10 times per shift. At 1:15 p.m., Dr. Pierce posted his masterpiece, a formal disciplinary action notice, printed on hospital letterhead, her name in bold letters like a warrant. Disciplinary action, R.N. Sullivan, insubordination. Unsafe practice. Failure to follow chain of command. Date and time stamped. His signature underneath, the kind of signature that came from old money and boarding schools. Every nurse who walked past slowed, reading. A resident Brooke had once helped study for her cardiology exam averted her gaze so completely it might as well have been an insult. The young phlebotomist who'd asked Brooke for advice about her mother's hypertension suddenly needed to check something in a supply cabinet when they nearly crossed paths. Brooke read the notice once. Didn't touch it. Didn't protest it. Just absorbed the fact that in a single morning, Pierce had transformed her from colleague to contaminant. She could feel him watching. She looked up, and there he was, framed in the doorway of his office like a portrait of satisfaction, his hand curved around a coffee mug in a posture of leisured victory. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then walked past him without acknowledgement. The restraint wasn't civility. It was precision. It was the particular restraint that comes from someone counting the moments until she could move. The medication room rejected her access badge at 2:07 a.m. The electronic lock stayed red. No green light. No click of release. Just a soft buzz of denial. She paged the night supervisor, one of Pierce's allies, a woman named Cartwright who'd worked trauma for 15 years and understood that loyalty to the attending physician was worth more than fairness to staff nurses. Cartwright took 20 minutes to respond. When she arrived, she moved with the deliberate slowness of someone performing inconvenience. Your credentials should have transferred automatically, Cartwright said, not looking at her. Might be a system error on your end. A system error on your end. As if Brooke had somehow sabotaged her own access code. By the next shift, her name was gone from the crash cart authorization list. She discovered it mid-emergency when a post-op patient in 412 developed an arrhythmia, and the locked trauma cart, the one with the defibrillator, the emergency medications, the equipment that meant the difference between a saved life and a corpse, wouldn't acknowledge her fingerprint. A resident named Halloway had to override it manually while the patient's heart did its confused stuttering dance. She saw the hesitation in his face. The way his eyes slid away from hers. Pierce had orchestrated it perfectly. Over the course of 6 shifts, he'd reassigned every competent resident away from the ICU. Replaced them with his loyalists, physicians who owed him favors, who wouldn't question his orders, who understood that their future was tethered to his satisfaction. The schedule looked random if you didn't know to look for the pattern. But Brooke had learned pattern recognition in a field hospital in Baghdad, where the difference between noticing details and missing them meant people lived or died. She pulled Major Garrett's chart that night. His sedation was too deep. The ventilator settings were outdated, he'd been on the same parameters for 72 hours, and his blood gases were drifting, subtle enough that Pierce wasn't monitoring them closely, obvious enough that she could read the deterioration in a single glance. She adjusted the settings and documented everything meticulously, each change recorded, each timestamp exact, each notation clear enough that anyone reviewing the chart would see that the patient was being protected by someone other than his attending physician. At 3:14 a.m., sitting in her car in the parking garage, Brooke opened her gym locker and checked the contents. The field trauma kit was exactly where she'd left it, the kind of medical equipment that wasn't supposed to exist outside a combat zone, the kind that could save a life in the moment between emergency and help arriving. Needles. Chest tubes. Hemostatic gauze. Medications that hadn't been prescribed because they didn't exist in civilian medical supply chains. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 5th Special Forces emblem, worn soft as a prayer from being carried close to her heart for 7 years. The same patch her son had died wearing. Her phone buzzed. Encrypted message from the Pentagon contact, the one who'd placed her at St. Michael's 8 months ago, Garrett investigating procurement fraud. Cardiac event suspicious. Maintain position. Monitor. Maintain position. The words felt like a cage. The nursing job wasn't the real job. The nursing job was the cover. The real mission was keeping Major Garrett alive long enough for him to expose the people who'd gotten her son killed. And Pierce was making it impossible to stay invisible. At 7:43 a.m., Brooke watched Pierce enter the hospital administrator's office on the 3rd floor, a folder thick with documentation under his arm. She was 2 rooms away, ostensibly checking on a different patient, listening with the particular attention of someone who'd learned to absorb threat information from a distance. Through the partially open door, she heard his voice, calm and clinical, doing what he'd been doing to her for 8 months, building a case with the precision of a prosecutor. Patient safety issue. Sullivan's competence is questionable. She's got gaps in her training. I'm concerned about her judgment. She needs to be removed from critical care immediately. The administrator's voice was soft, non-committal. Do you have documentation? Everything. Pierce held up the folder. Everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The medication room door wouldn't open at 0200 hours. Brooke swiped her badge. Nothing. The electronic lock remained dark, refusing entry. She tried again. Same result. The fluorescent light above the keypad hummed like an insect trapped in a wall, and she stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds before reaching for her pager. The night supervisor, Michelle Chen, didn't answer for 20 minutes. Brooke waited in the hallway outside the locked room, hand steady, breathing measured. She knew why the delay mattered. She knew why Michelle was making her wait. Every minute was information. Every unanswered page was a message. Pierce had already moved through the chain of command, already poisoned the well, already told the night supervisor that Brooke Sullivan was a safety risk, that her access should be restricted, that she couldn't be trusted with controlled substances or critical medications. When Michelle finally emerged from the east corridor, her face carried the careful neutrality of someone following orders she disagreed with but wouldn't defy. She was a good nurse. 15 years at St. Michael's. Trained under systems where hierarchy meant survival. He blocked your access, Michelle said quietly, not quite meeting Brooke's eyes. Dr. Pierce submitted a formal restriction at 1930 hours. Said you were practicing outside your scope and that controlled medications needed to be dispensed only by residents or attending physicians until the investigation concludes. Brooke didn't ask what investigation. She already knew, the write-up on the unit board, the formal complaint, the mythology Pierce had constructed, falsified certifications, fired from 3 hospitals, unsafe hands, a danger to patients. Major Garrett needs morphine for his pain, Brooke said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't tremble. Just stated the fact like someone reading a vital sign from a monitor. I can get it, Michelle said. You can prepare it, supervise its administration, but the final dosing and push has to come from a resident. Those are his orders. It wasn't an order. It was orchestrated theater dressed as protocol. Brooke turned away from the locked medication room and moved toward the ICU nursing station with the kind of stillness that made people step aside without realizing they'd done it. From her position at the desk, she could see Garrett's room 2 doors down, see the monitors glowing with numbers that were starting to drift into uncomfortable territory, see his wife asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his knee the way people touch the people they're terrified to lose. That was when she noticed the assignments had shifted again. The care board showed a completely different team for Garrett's care than had been posted during day shift. The capable residents, the ones who actually read charts, who asked questions, who thought independently, had vanished. In their place were 3 names she recognized from Pierce's lunch circle: residents who deferred to attending physicians like supplicants to a deity, who treated protocol like gospel, who would never question an order from authority no matter what the monitors were saying. Brooke moved to the call schedule posted behind the nursing station. It was handwritten in Pierce's distinctive script, changes made just hours earlier. The full-time critical care attending who typically stayed after 2,100 hours was marked as cancelled, staffing adjustment. In his place, a part-time resident rotating through ICU for the month, someone Pierce had mentioned in the locker room 3 days ago had promising potential for growth in the Pierce mentorship program. The on-call schedule for the next 48 hours showed similar patterns. Every backup position filled with someone Brooke had heard Pierce praise. Every experienced senior resident pulled to other units. Every potential ally systematically removed. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't even standard hospital politics. This was the methodical removal of every variable that might prevent what Pierce wanted to happen. She understood the full scope of it in the time it took her to read the board. Pierce had spent 8 months building credibility, 8 months positioning himself as the voice of safety and reason, 8 months creating a narrative where Brooke Sullivan was the liability. And now he was applying that credibility to create a situation where Major Garrett, the man whose son had served with Brooke, the man she was under Pentagon assignment to protect, would be surrounded exclusively by people who would follow Pierce's guidance without question, would defer to his judgment about imaging and timing and when intervention was truly necessary. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce hadn't done this just to isolate Brooke. He'd done this because Garrett's condition was actually deteriorating. Because the fluid around his heart was genuine. Because the trajectory on his monitors suggested something beyond cardiac instability, something that would require intervention, judgment calls, the kind of decisive action that doctors with reputations to protect often avoided in favor of more imaging, more consults, more time to cover themselves. Brooke moved toward her locker without alerting anyone. The locker room was empty at this hour, just the faint smell of antiseptic and the white noise of industrial ventilation. She opened her locker and reached past the spare shoes, past the jacket with the unit patch sewn deep into its lining where no one would ever see it unless they knew to look, and found the grey equipment bag she'd kept since her discharge from the Army Nurse Corps. She'd maintained it without thinking about why, the way soldiers keep their uniforms, sailors keep their dress whites, people who've worn different uniforms keep the tools that kept them alive. Inside, supplies. Real supplies. The kind you carry when you understand that institutional systems sometimes fail, that access gets restricted, that there are moments when the only thing between a person and death is what you carried with your own hands. A 14-gauge needle. Not the pediatric, not the 16-gauge that hospitals preferred, the real thing, the field kit needle designed for the velocity and pressure of tension pneumothorax release, the kind you used when there was no time for perfection, only for function. Antiseptic swab sealed in foil. Tape. A chest seal borrowed from a combat lifesaver kit she'd kept without ever being asked for it back. She didn't say the words aloud. Didn't perform the soldier's prayer or the superstition of checked equipment. She simply confirmed what she already knew: if the moment came, if the monitors showed what the monitors would show, if the 15 doctors Pierce was setting up arrived exactly as he'd planned for them to arrive, she would have this. She wouldn't be restricted. She wouldn't be locked out. She wouldn't be left with nothing but the ability to watch. Brooke closed the locker carefully and moved back toward the ICU at 0243 hours, the medication room still locked behind her, the on-call schedule still arranged like a chess game, the monitors in Garrett's room beginning their slow drift toward the kind of numbers that announce themselves through fluorescent lights that hum like trapped insects, through the voice of monitors that won't be silent much longer. The night was still quiet. The city beyond the windows still slept. But Brooke Sullivan stood at the nursing station with her field kit in her locker and her rank buried under scrubs and her son's unit patch stitched into the lining of a jacket no one had ever examined, and she understood exactly what was about to happen. She was ready. The monitor alarmed at 0300 hours. Not a gentle warning, a screaming, relentless electronic wail that turned every head in the ICU toward Major Garrett's bed. His oxygen saturation was in free fall. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but something underneath it had gone catastrophically wrong. His chest wall moved in paradox, one side rising while the other collapsed inward, a sign that pressure was building where it shouldn't be, compressing his lung like a fist around a balloon. Brooke was 3 steps away when the code was called. She didn't run. She moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd performed triage in rubble, who'd worked by flashlight and the sound of distant mortars, whose hands had learned that panic was a luxury. The crash cart roared past her, the one Pierce had restricted her from accessing 2 days prior, pushed by a resident whose name she'd already forgotten because he'd never bothered to learn hers. Within 90 seconds, they arrived. 15 of them. Not the full code team. Something worse. 15 physicians, summoned by Pierce through a carefully orchestrated chain of calls. She heard his voice from the doorway, safety concerns about primary team competency. We need oversight. The words were poison wrapped in protocol. They came in surgical masks and starched white coats, filling the room in a semicircle around Garrett's bed like vultures measuring carrion. Residents. Fellows. Attendings from departments that had no business here. All of them standing in tableau, staring down at Major Garrett's plummeting oxygen saturation like it was a problem to be discussed rather than solved. We need imaging first, one of them said. A cardiothoracic fellow with the kind of condescension that only came from elite pedigree. Could be a cardiac cause. Could be PE. We shouldn't move without. His O2 is 84, Brooke said. Her voice didn't rise. Voices that rose were voices that weren't obeyed. His intention pneumothorax. We're out of time for consultations. And you would know this how? Pierce. His face was flushed the particular shade of purple that came from watching a plan unravel in real time. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, blocking the equipment crash cart. Blocking her. Physical exam, Brooke said. Unilateral absent breath sounds. Tracheal deviation. Hypertension. Subcutaneous emphysema starting in the neck. She reeled off the constellation of findings like she was reading from a chart, because she wasn't guessing. She was reading a body the way some people read maps. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Now. Absolutely not. A different doctor this time, someone from the hospital board, recognizable only by the expensive watch and the kind of certainty that came from never being questioned. We don't have imaging confirmation. What if you perforate the lung further? What if there's a cardiac injury? His heart stops in the next for minutes, Brooke said. Imaging won't matter. The 15 doctors exchanged glances. The kind of glance that said they'd already decided. The kind that said a junior nurse, no matter how precise her assessment, would not be permitted to contradict their collective caution. The kind that said protecting themselves was more important than saving the man whose wife was in the waiting room and whose teenage son had his father's eyes. We should get cardiology, someone said. Get surgery on the phone. Let's do a portable chest X-ray first. Major Garrett's oxygen saturation dropped to 82. Then 80. His color was shifting from the pink of perfusion to the gray-white of tissue death. His wife had been there 6 hours earlier, holding his hand. His son had sat in a chair by the window, still believing his father would wake up and ask how football practice went. Brooke didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for consensus. Muscle memory took over, 15 years of field medicine, of making decisions when the only authority available was the clock. She moved through the semicircle of doctors like they were furniture, like their credentials were merely obstacles to step around rather than walls to stop her. Her right hand was already reaching for her locker, already pulling out the 14-gauge needle from the field kit she'd carried every single shift since Pierce had blocked her access to the crash cart. If you touch that patient, you're finished here, Pierce said. His voice cracked. Actually cracked. She didn't respond. Didn't slow. She palpated Garrett's chest wall, fingers moving across his ribs with surgical certainty, reading the anatomy through skin the way a violinist reads music. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands, steady as a surgical laser, positioned the needle at precise angle to the rib, angling upward to avoid the vessels running along the bone's inferior surface. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. That distinctive sound of pressure releasing, of catastrophic pressure meeting the outside world and equilibrating in a single breath. Like opening a door in a wall that should have been solid. The room went dead silent. Not the respectful silence of concentration. The stunned silence of witnessing something they'd been trained to think was beneath them, and watching it work perfectly in less than 5 minutes. "Get me a chest tube kit," Brooke said. Not a request. A command. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in situations where hesitation meant death. And a 20-minute ETA on thoracics. The resident who'd pushed the crash cart moved without waiting for Pierce's approval. One of the attendings stepped forward with the equipment. The 15 doctors remained in their semicircle, frozen like figures in a museum diorama, watching a nurse with military-grade composure perform a procedure that their collective caution had just prevented them from attempting. Garrett's oxygen saturation climbed. 85. 88. 92. His color returned, not the gray-white of approaching arrest, but the legitimate pink of adequate tissue perfusion. His blood pressure came up. His wife, in the waiting room, didn't know yet that the man she'd almost lost was coming back to her. His son, at the hospital cafeteria, didn't know yet that he would get to tell his father about practice after all. Pierce's face drained of color. Not the flush of embarrassment, but the white of comprehension. His sabotage had worked perfectly. He'd orchestrated the abandonment with surgical precision. He'd called in 15 physicians to create enough collective doubt that no single person would authorize intervention. He'd blocked her access, reassigned her team, isolated her from equipment. He'd constructed a cage of protocol so perfectly that she should have been paralyzed. She'd just blown a hole through it with a needle. "That's immediate termination," Pierce said. His voice was quiet now, which made it worse. Quiet voices were the ones that got enforced. "You practiced beyond your scope. You endangered the patient. Clear your locker." He was already pulling out his phone. Brooke could hear him calling security before she'd finished securing Garrett's chest tube. She could hear him calling administration, voice steady now, the narrative already prepared: insubordination, unsafe practice, practicing medicine without a license. Every word technically defensible. Every word a lie wrapped in truth. Security arrived in 19 minutes. By that time, Garrett was stable. His ventilator was properly adjusted. His wife was holding his hand again, tears streaming down her face, telling him he'd had a crisis but he was going to be okay. His teenage son was standing in the doorway, watching his father's chest rise and fall, watching him live instead of watching him die. By that time, Brooke's badge had been deactivated. Her parking pass revoked. Her locker had been emptied by someone who wasn't her, and the contents placed in a cardboard box that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and bureaucratic finality. Pierce handed her the termination letter himself. The signature was still wet. Practicing beyond scope. Endangering patient safety. Immediate termination for cause. She read it the way she read bodies, looking for the hidden injuries beneath the surface language. What it really said was, "You were right. You saved him. And we're removing you anyway. Campus security will see you out," Pierce said. The walk through the ICU felt like walking through water. The staff who'd isolated her in the break room didn't look at her. The nurses who'd accepted the narrative about her falsified credentials stared at their screens. The doctors who'd stood in that semicircle kept their eyes on their charts, knowing exactly what had just happened, knowing exactly what they'd failed to do, knowing exactly who they'd chosen to become instead of the people who might have tried to save him themselves. That night, Brooke stood at the bus stop on Spee Boulevard in Denver, cardboard box balanced on her hip. Rain came down in sheets, the kind of cold April rain that seemed to wash the world clean of everything except itself. water beaded on the cracked Air Force mug her son had sent her from his first deployment to Baghdad. A half-dead succulent from her desk, its leaves papery and exhausted. And underneath it all, the photograph, 22 years old in dress uniform, same unit patch as the one Major Garrett had worn to St. Michael's ICU, the same patch that was currently stitched into the lining of a jacket hanging in her apartment, the patch that had sent her across the country with orders to protect a man her own son had died serving with. Rain streaked down her face as she stood there, but her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The trembling, if anyone had been watching, wouldn't have been fear. It would have been restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from surviving worse than this, from losing more than just a job. She pressed her thumb against the photograph through the wet cardboard, connecting with her son through the package, connecting with the promise she'd made when they'd handed her the sealed orders, keep him alive. She'd done that. She'd saved his life while 15 physicians chose their career safety over his. She'd done her job and lost the cover that let her keep doing it. 2 days later, everything would change. 6 months later, the rehab unit smelled like fresh paint and possibility, antiseptic and sunlight mixing through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Denver skyline. Major Garrett walked the polished corridor with a cane, his left side still favoring that careful rhythm of bodies that had learned to trust themselves again. His wife held his right arm. His teenage son, the same boy who'd stood frozen in the ICU while his father flatlined, matched pace beside him, watching his father's face for signs of strain. There were none. Garrett moved with the determined calm of someone who'd already survived the worst the body could inflict. Brooke stood waiting at the corridor's end, wearing her white coat again. Not as a nurse beneath the hospital's pecking order. As Captain Sullivan, Army Nurse Corps, her silver star and bronze star visible on her dress uniform beneath the open coat, caught the light like promises kept. The hospital had reinstated her with full honors, back pay calculated to the penny, and a formal apology written by the hospital's legal counsel that mentioned neither negligence nor liability, just the simple facts of her reinstatement, her commendation, her correctness. Her credentials, which Pierce had spent months claiming were fraudulent, had been validated by the Pentagon itself. Garrett saw her and stopped. His wife's hand tightened on his arm. His son's eyes widened. He'd heard the story by now, how this nurse had saved his father's life while 15 doctors stood paralyzed, how she'd been fired for it, how the military had come back for her like she was someone worth retrieving. Captain Sullivan, Garrett said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man speaking to someone who outranked him not in title but in something deeper. In action. In the kind of courage that didn't announce itself. Major, Brooke replied, and she stepped forward to shake his hand. Her grip was steady. His was strong again. Around them, the hallway seemed to hold its breath. Garrett's wife smiled, and then his son asked the question that had been waiting, "Is it true you were in Baghdad?" Brooke met Garrett's eyes. He nodded, permission, or perhaps acknowledgement. They both knew what she was. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines attached to 5th Special Forces Group, Brooke said quietly. 2 tours. Your father's command. The boy's face shifted. Calculation. Understanding. And my mom said you're a nurse. I'm both, Brooke said. The second thing let me do the first thing. Garrett gestured to a sitting area, cushioned chairs, a window, the kind of space designed for people learning how to be alive again. They Saturday. His wife held his hand. His son sat forward, elbows on his knees, listening with the intensity of youth that knows it's hearing something true. Garrett began speaking, and his voice was the voice of a commander recounting his people, careful, detailed, honoring each moment. He talked about Brooke's son, about how the boy had moved through operations with a kind of grace that came from understanding something most people never learned, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to move anyway. He talked about a firefight in Fallujah where Brooke's son had stayed behind to cover a withdrawal, how he'd held a street corner for 47 minutes while civilians evacuated through a back alley. How he'd done it without being ordered. How he'd saved 3 lives that day. I heard the radio traffic, Garrett said. He never called for help. Just reported his position. Just kept the enemy suppressed. Garrett paused. When he finally pulled back, he told me he couldn't leave them. That's simple. Can't leave them, sir. And he didn't. Brooke's hand moved to her jacket pocket unconsciously, fingers finding the shape of the faded patch sewn into the lining, 5th group insignia, worn soft as prayer from 18 months of her touching it in the dark, in break rooms, at bus stops in the rain. The patch that had come home when her son didn't. He talked about you, Garrett continued, and his eyes held something like compassion, like he understood exactly what it cost her to hear this. Never by name, OPSEC. But he said his mother taught him that the mission came first. That saving someone else was the only kind of winning that mattered. He said he'd never met anyone braver than you. Brooke couldn't speak. The words were there, in her chest, but they were the wrong size for her throat. She nodded. Her eye stayed on Garrett's, and his wife squeezed her husband's hand harder, understanding. He died the way you taught him, Garrett said quietly. Thinking about someone else first. That matters, Captain. I needed you to know it mattered. The boy was crying, silent tears on his face. His sister, no, that wasn't right, his mother squeezed his shoulder. Brooke reached across the space between them and gripped Garrett's knee, the only gesture her controlled composure would allow. It was enough. It had to be. Outside, in the emergency drive bay, an ambulance was being prepped. In the ICU, monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The hospital moved on, as hospitals do, because people needed it to move on. But in this corner of the rehab unit, time had shifted into something else. A room where stories lived. Where the dead were honored not with silence but with the accounts of those who'd stood beside them. Brooke's other hand pressed against the patch in her pocket. Still there. Still worn soft. Still a prayer. 200 miles away, in a strip mall community college classroom, Dr. Pierce stood before 12 disinterested students, demonstrating chest compressions on a rubber dummy whose plastic face had no expression, no judgment. The state medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. The hospital had terminated him for cause, not just the termination itself, but the conspiracy that had preceded it. The emails. The altered schedules. The phone records showing him coordinating with all 15 doctors who'd abandoned Garrett's code. The hospital's IT director, Marcus Chen, Navy veteran, had seen everything. Chen had been monitoring Pierce for weeks, suspicious of the systematic erasure of Brooke's credentials, the strategic sabotage, the methodical isolation. And when Pierce had logged into the security system at 0300 hours to delete the footage of those 15 physicians standing by while Major Garrett died on the monitor, Chen had been watching. Watching as Pierce's fingers moved across the keyboard. Watching as Pierce tried to purge the records. Watching as Pierce, in his desperation to bury the truth, had instead written his own confession in login credentials and timestamps. Chen didn't stop the deletion immediately. Chen let it play out. Let it become evidence. Then Chen pulled every frame, backed it up to encrypted servers, and sent copies to the State Medical Board, to Pentagon investigators, to every authority that had jurisdiction over the conspiracy. When the general arrived at St. Michael's demanding the security footage, Chen walked into the conference room with a laptop, plugged in, and pressed play. The footage spoke in its own language. 15 doctors arriving, examining Garrett, deferring. Pierce visible in the corner, phone in hand, coordinating. Then the crucial moment, Pierce at the security terminal at 0300 hours, attempting to erase evidence, his login clearly visible on every keystroke. A man trying to bury a truth that had already escaped. The State Medical Board investigator had arrived with documents. Fabricated complaints about Brooke. Emails to hospital staff spreading rumors about her credentials being falsified. All time-stamped. All saved. All proof of a conspiracy built not to protect patients, but to destroy a woman who threatened Pierce's authority. They'd escorted him from the building the same way they'd escorted Brooke, security walking behind him, staff watching as he carried his personal effects in a box. The only difference was that his walk ended in investigation, in suspension, in the slow professional death of a man who'd confused competence with character. Now he stood before students who'd chosen a community college CPR class because it was cheap, because they needed the certification, because they didn't care who was teaching them. He demonstrated compression technique for $18 an hour, his medical credentials suspended, his reputation destroyed, his applications to other hospitals left unanswered by people who'd heard the story. In Denver's medical circles, Dr. Pierce had become a cautionary tale. What happened when you confused power with righteousness? When you underestimated the people you harassed? When you forgot that veterans protect their own? Back at St. Michael's, Brooke stood in the locker room, pinning her silver star to her uniform. The medal caught the fluorescent light, not the harsh, humming fluorescence of the break room where staff had abandoned her, but the clean light of a space where she was finally allowed to be fully herself. The Marine liaison shook her hand. The general presented her with a commendation letter, official Pentagon letterhead, signed by people with surnames that carried weight. Her records, the ones Pierce had claimed were fraudulent, were restored in full. 2 tours completed. 3 times recommended for commendation. Captain Sullivan, Army Nurse Corps, with all the authority that title contained. She walked through the ICU, and the staff met her eyes. Not with the sideways glances of before, not with the careful avoidance. With respect. With the particular respect that comes from understanding you'd been wrong about someone. From knowing that the quiet person you'd underestimated was actually the strongest person in the room. Later, standing before a group of nursing students in the hospital's education wing, Brooke spoke with a voice that no longer asked permission to exist. The voice that had come back when she'd needed it. The voice of someone who'd survived worse than hospital politics, worse than isolation, worse than the slow poison of other people's disrespect. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching, she told them. Not the medals. Not the commendations. What you do when it's just you and the patient and the knowledge that no one will ever know. That's where character lives. She touched the patch inside her jacket one final time, the faded 5th group insignia that had lived in darkness for so long it had become part of her skin. Then she turned and walked into Major Garrett's room, where he waited with stories of her son, not the painful stories, but the stories a soldier tells about another soldier. The ones that carry pride instead of just grief. The ones that let her remember him not just as the boy she'd buried, but as the man he'd become. The one who'd learned from her that saving someone else was the only kind of winning that mattered. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, subscribe to this channel. Comment below, have you ever had to prove yourself to someone who refused to see who you really were? And share this story with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together.